Okay, cool. So welcome everyone to this week's edition of PalaeoPERCS. It's really nice to have so many people here today. Our speaker is Charuta Kulkarni from the Open University in the UK. And the title of her talk is EARNEST, Examining the Agroforestry Landscape Resilience in India to Inform Social-Ecological Sustainability in the Tropics. So just a bit of housekeeping. So we value the participation of everyone interested in the paleosciences. Please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar, and remember to mute yourself for the duration of the talk. You can ask questions by chatting to the questions host today, so this is Elizabeth, and technical issues should also go to her too. We're also accepting nominations, including self-nominations for our speaker pool, so please go to our website and suggest people. We've had some really amazing people suggested so far. Also remember to check your spam and remember to save list our new email, which is palaeopercs@palaeopercs.com, so that you receive all our emails. We also have a survey monkey for the demographic info. This is anonymous, optional and encouraged, and will be posted in the chat window shortly. So the format of today's seminar, so we have welcome and announcements for 5 minutes, then the talk, then a moderated Q&A, then a small group discussion using the breakout rooms, which we really encourage you to stay for. Then we have our after tea talk with our speaker. So Charuta very kindly agreed to stay. And we really encourage you to stay for this as well. Don't forget to send your questions via the chat to the questions host. So you can do this during the talk or after the talk. We'll moderate that. Another thing, if you don't want to do breakout rooms, you're very welcome to stay behind, and then we'll put you into a waiting room and then admit you back in for tea time. So to introduce today's speaker, so Charuta did her bachelor's and her master's at the University of Pune in India, followed by her Ph.D. at the City University of New York in the US. And she's currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of Geography and the Department of Environment, Earth and Ecosystems in the Open University. So I'm now going to hand over to Charuta for her talk.
Thank you so much, Rahmat, for a generous introduction, I would say. Could you please stop sharing so I could continue? Because it doesn't. Yeah, perfect. Can you please confirm that you can see my screen? Are you able to?
Yeah, all good.
All good, yeah. And can I please ask you to intimate me like 5 minutes before if I'm running? I don't want to run over time.
Yeah, we'll send you a 5-minute one.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, PalaeoPERCS, for the invitation, and I'm really excited and thrilled to be here and to be able to present my Marie Curie research. The title is really long. I'm so sorry for that, but we should go ahead with the acronym because we are dealing with an EARNEST problem here to understand how we can resolve some of the sustainability issues in the tropical landscape, especially which are under really high anthropogenic pressures. So although I'm speaking here, I'm standing on the shoulders of the giants, which are just right beneath the names I have here, including Shonil Bhagwat, Walter Finsinger, Pallavi Anand, Sandra Nogue, and Kathy Willis. And each of them, they are from various institutions across Europe, including Open University, ESM, or University of Montpellier in France, University of Oxford, University of Southampton. And this talk and this work has been done and has been was able to be done because of the European Union and Marie Curie funding. So I would love to elaborate on that towards the end of my talk, towards the end of my presentation on my last slide. And I would love to go ahead and to be able to talk about the Marie Curie program itself and how to crack Marie Curie. If anybody is interested, we could go ahead and talk during the tea and coffee session. So when it comes to EARNEST, it basically revolves around one key eco-unit, which is called as agroforestry. As the name suggests, agroforestry is a land management practice which is inclusive of agriculture and forestry. So that's why, as the name necessitates, it basically shows the intentional management of woodland on the agricultural land itself. So agroforestry is considered to be one of the very widely recognized nature-based solutions, as we could think about. And as we are going towards 2030 and we are thinking about the sustainable development goals, we are thinking about agroforestry as a very key solution about sustenance for millions of people who depend on these landscape, who depend on agriculture itself, and people who are able to contribute to actual biodiversity conservation. We are really having this pressing issue of loss of biodiversity. Tropics especially, who house half of the world's population, or if not more, then what to do with the landscapes which are at such a high anthropogenic pressures, where subsistence of millions is dependent on them, and how should we solve even the ecological aspects of it, which is the biodiversity conservation aspect. So agroforestry is also seen, because of the involvement of trees, as a natural solution, a nature-based solution for biodiversity conservation. And the last part of it is basically the climate change mitigation. Is why agroforestry is good for planet itself is it does not only take care of the social sides, but it also take care of the ecological sides. By involving trees, by maintaining trees on the landscape itself, what we are able to achieve is we are able to create more and more green spaces wherever possible, and mitigating the climate change in the process. So that's why agroforestry is a very widely recognized, a very widely known, and very widely adopted across the world. And this is one of the very key eco unit, as I said, for the project EARNEST. And how did I go about it, or how did I go as I landed into the idea of conceiving this Marie Curie project? Is examining the agroforestry landscape resilience in India to inform social ecological sustainability in the tropics. So once again, the key eco unit is the agroforestry, but along with that, there is another eco unit we could think about, is the sacred forest group. And the sacred word is very curious here, because these are the forests which are kept, which are maintained, which are conserved in the name of some ABC deity. These are the religious or cultural practices which are basically the means of conservation and forestation. And as I started looking into these two eco units and their coexistence, I realized that they do not only exist in one part of the tropic, but they are really widespread across the tropics. We could see them all the way from Costa Rica to Indonesia. So we are basically looking at these landscapes which have these two eco units side by side, coexisting for centuries, if not millennia, because these are tropics and people have been living there for millennia, if not more, right? So these are the global, very global kinds of landscape, and their interaction, I found them very interesting as such. And looking specifically at India, which is my homeland, so I realized that taking the cognizance of multifarious benefits of agroforestry, not sacred groves as much, but the agroforestry, India came up with a national agroforestry policy in 2014. So idea is to increase the forest cover. We all need forests, we all need trees, but we all need them in a certain way. We all need them by simultaneously feeding millions and billions of people, right? So in terms of that, in terms of achieving the tree cover, which is essential once again for the carbon sequestration and to alleviate any pressures on the agricultural land, what was the key tool which was used? It was basically agroforestry. So maintaining intentionally woodland on agricultural land itself. So agroforestry basically envisaged doubling or increasing essentially the area under agroforestry and simultaneously increasing the national forest cover. And when I decided to look deeper into this, I realized that there are two key players who would actually implement this policy. Once again, it's agroforestry. So who are involved is basically agriculturalists or farmers, and forestry is in the hands of Indian Forest Services or forestry departments. And when I looked into these two key players and their actual policies or their actual land management strategies, what I saw was a direct conflict. So when it comes to farmers, especially in the tropical region, including India, they are so much accustomed to slash and burn agriculture. So they like to use fires in the process of maintaining landscape, while Indian Forestry Services have a big no-no for fires. So once again, these two key players for the agroforestry national agroforestry policy, its implementation, this is an ecologically and economically very important policy. These two players are in direct conflict with each other. So I found this particular problem very, very, very interesting. And I said that why not to put whatever skills I have, which is basically paleoecological skills, to work and try to find out, could there be a middle ground? Could there be something which could help out with the policy itself by actually studying the agroforestry landscape, which are once again in coexistence with sacred forest groves in many parts of India. So while studying that, fire remained as a main protagonist in my story. So what you would be hearing from me today is fire, fire, fire everywhere, and how to maintain these and how to manage these and what not to do or what to do. And we could continue discussing on it, what could be good or what could be bad. Are there good fires as well as bad fires? So when it comes to actually studying agroforestry, so what I chose, or for my Marie Curie project, what we chose as a model representative system as a tropical socio-ecological system or social ecological system, that's SES, I found it in the Western Ghats of India. So if I could point you quickly, Western Ghats of India is nothing but a several kilometers long, several thousand kilometers long to be precise. It's a north-south mountain chain which goes parallel to the west coast of India, which is right here. If people have traveled to India, or at least they would know Mumbai is somewhere right here. So we are basically trying to see, this is a part of Gujarat, state of Maharashtra, going all the way to Kerala. You might be hearing about floods and other monsoon related news at the moment. So that is this part, Kerala, right here. So this is a literally several thousand kilometers long mountain chain, which is also one of the wettest regions on the surface of the earth. So it basically rains very, very, very heavily in this particular region. And that's why you could see all these really spectacular landscapes. And these spectacular landscapes are spectacular, once again, from ecological point of view. If we could see, so this is basically nothing but all the 25 biodiversity hotspot. We do have more. This is an older study at the moment, like as compared to today. But out of 25 biodiversity hotspot, Western Ghats, which is right here once again, 21 is one of the biodiversity hotspots in the world. And it is not just any biodiversity hotspot, it is a biodiversity hotspot which supports world highest population density. So if we try to see that this is a very ecologically a very interesting system, at the moment it is also socially very interesting system. And these two interesting systems, they come together because we can see that many of these Western Ghat landscapes are basically serving people and people serving these landscapes by nothing but agroforestry systems. So you can see that the people have intentionally maintained woodland in order to get the better agricultural yield, and which are simultaneously in existence with something like this, which is nothing but the sacred groves. It doesn't have to have any kind of specifically deity like feature or deity like construction or structure over there. It could simply be trees growing there for years and years and nobody touching them, just because it's a cultural way of saying thank you to the landscape in a way. So Western Ghats of India, I thought it to be a model system which is representative to tropical socio-ecological system. And when it comes to Project EARNEST, I decided to look at what would be the long-term resilience of Western Ghats agroforestry system itself. So I decided that it would be interesting to examine long-term transformations of these landscapes in relation to fires and monsoons, climate, of course, specifically how monsoonal variations contribute to fires, to be precise, and try to understand sacred forest groves as a cultural means or cultural drivers of reforestation or conservation. And it was, once again, as I said, the interplay between the two, which would be agroforestry landscapes and sacred grove landscapes. So the intermingling or interactions between the two could be one of the interesting issues in terms of sustainably managing biodiversity on the landscape itself. So when it comes to actual sampling and coring, the samples and cores come from the central part of India. central part of Western Ghats, to be precise. And there are basically 4 different cores which were taken back in 2005. So this is basically a long-running project. And once again, I have come, sort of a legacy project, which I'm carrying forward in a way that there are 2 agroforest cores which are taken from 2 different agroforestry systems, which are, you could see, once again, they are hand in hand with sacred groves. Some of them are pretty close to agroforestry systems, some of them are slightly far. So for the sake of today's talk, I will specifically be focusing on this particular agroforestry system right here, BOP or Agroforest 1, I would refer to it as, which is once again pretty close with another agroforestry system as well as a sacred grove. So it would be interesting to see how first and third research objectives would come through. And once again, as I said, I decided to study this at the backdrop of national agroforestry policy, because once again, we do have paleoecological studies, and there are ways that we do convey the information, but sometimes it is very difficult for the policymakers to translate this particular information. So for the sake of this particular project, we decided that we could deliver resilience or transformation scenarios at a resolution of 20 to 50 year. That could be a tangible window for building policy implications in the Western Ghat, as well as for wet tropical systems or tropical socio-ecological systems at large. So this would have been, you could say, an USP for this particular project, saying that to be able to translate the science into policy itself and to be able to come up with the actual policy, very, although crude, slightly in a way, if you could say that, crude kind of policy implications at the backdrop of national agroforestry policy. So moving forward, the approach in terms of methodology had been the past for the future, which is the paleoecology for future ecological management. So once again, the classic tools, as one could imagine, could be the fossil pollen data, trying to unravel some of the key entities, such as compositional changes, such as what would be the extent of the forest, what could be the extent of the native trees, once again, what could be the part of the grassland, what could be the herbaceous understory and whatnot. The key aspect would be plant diversity, how many taxa are present at the land in the landscape at any point in time, and also along with that is the temporal beta diversity, which is also known as the degree of transformation, if you want to call it. So that is something which is also important in terms of the vegetational perspective. So to be able to understand how forests were doing or how forests were transforming, we do need all of them. More than one entity is essential in order for us to present what are the different transformation. The second aspect would be the humans. So trying to understand what could be the anthropogenic fire regimes. And when I say anthropogenic fire regimes, I do really mean anthropogenic fire regime, because we are dealing with rainforest here. And within the rainforest, we can imagine that the natural fires are almost always rare. And that had been one of the very, you could say, very key calibrated kind of situation for this Western Ghat agroforestry systems, that any fires in this landscape are anthropogenic fires in nature. Unless instigated, fires do not exist in this landscape, because it rains and rains over there. And throughout the year, although it is monsoon, we do get monsoon during June to September, but the moisture and the soil moisture, if we could measure, it stays on and on for years and years, if not for centuries. And in the drier part of Western Ghat, the situation could be different, but this was basically, all these cores come from the wettest part of the Western Ghats. So all the fires in this case, coming from macro or macroscopic charcoal data, are going to be anthropogenic fires, although their degree might be slightly different, as we could see. The very important, I think, aspect which is connected to humans here is anthropogenic fires are very much associated with what kind of land use system which has existed before and after. So that is very important in case of tropical landscape, which had been, once again, habitated by humans for millennia, and people have been using fires traditionally for millennia as well. So once again, it is very important to look at this landscape from a time lens, from a longer lens of time, trying to find out what has happened, where these landscapes have come from in a way, and trying to see that what had been the natural kind of fire regime, like natural anthropogenic fire regime, that could be the right word as such, in connection with the actual history on land. And it could be the regional history and regional aspects of it. And the third aspect which we want to tackle, or we want to discuss here, is the climatic variables, specifically the monsoonal variability, because that is very much associated with whether fires would spread across the landscapes or not. So periods of enhanced aridity are very important, because these are the periods will make sure the fire, whether it will go beyond the agricultural landscapes where fires are practiced, and whether they will reach out or spread out into the forested landscapes. So taking this particular approach, moving ahead and trying to see some actual data sets, which once again came from Western Ghats of India. So within that process, I think, like, I'll just simply dwell upon this for a second. Is once again, as I said, the idea is to bring some transformation scenarios or resilience scenarios. And one of the models which is set by, we could say, Bhagwat et al. In 2012, is basically trying to see how much vegetation cover improves, or any kind of, you could say, biological indicator which increases or decreases with respect to the disturbance. So you could imagine, if the disturbance is kind of high, you would basically imagine the resilience would be low. So that means in case of vegetation cover, or in case of any indicator, for example, plant diversity in this case, if it declines over time with increasing disturbance, we are talking about a system which is low resilience. Opposite to that would be something which is high resilient, the system which starts at one point, and then the end point of that particular system is also somewhere close to it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be showing any negative kind of trend during that process. So we did try to identify some of these scenarios within this process. So looking at the actual data, let me orient you once again a little bit. So this particular record comes from central part of the Western Ghats, this BOP core agroforest, and it basically goes all the way to the last 4,000 years. And this 4,000 year mark is very interesting here, because we are looking at the 4.1 KY event. From there on, we could see basically Indian summer monsoon system is getting towards, giving up, trying drier and drier trends. So we are looking at last 4,000 years, in the sense that could be periods of enhanced aridity as such. And when there are periods of aridity, are they basically synchronized with fires or anthropogenic fires? So people have responded to enhanced aridity by using more fires or not? And if that's the case, then what could be the synergistic effects of fires and enhanced aridity on landscapes, or canopy cover, or even plant diversity? So let me run everybody quickly through what exactly we are dealing with here. So we are looking at, once again, a model data right here and a proxy data right here, and trying to understand if there are any regional and subcontinent scale aridity we can see in this particular record. So once again, higher up, higher the rain, or higher the Indian summer monsoon, or there is no weakening as such, we are looking at this end of the graph itself. And if we are going towards the aridity or drying trend, is basically this way. So Indian summer monsoon, if it is showing certain kind of weakening, we are basically looking into this particular direction. So next one I would like to bring out is basically that when it comes to comparing these two, or comparing regional as well as some continent scale Indian summer monsoon records, model as well as proxy data, we can see that there are three aridity sequences, or three aridity periods as such. So once again, aridity period would mean higher risk of fire spreading into forests beyond agricultural land, because fires, anthropogenic fires, once again, are practiced on agricultural land itself, right? So moving ahead, or moving up in this particular graph, as we could see, we are looking at the anthropogenic fires. And here we do have the macro charcoal data as well as micro charcoal data, and they do not necessarily say that this could be the local fire versus regional fire, because once again, there are methodological advances which have come up recently, which could tell us that it could be interpreted as both, right? So according to that, if we want to see that anthropogenic fires once again show us that there are two distinct fire periods over the last 4,000 years. Yes, fire have been absent between 4,000 and 1800. And then we could see the first fire appearing here between 1800s and 1400s, and eventually dying out to re-emerge once again around 400 and going all the way to the present day. So there are two distinct fire periods between, once again, 1800 and 1400 years before present, and the second one is 400 to 0 year before present, that is present day. So these two are essentially points of major systemic transformation. If we want to look at this particular system through a lens of time, we could see that when it comes to having the first fire in this particular landscape, which is roughly around 1800, that could be the first point of switch as such within this particular system. That switch is off once again around 1400, did not exist or almost negligible for next 1000 years as such. And then eventually it re-emerged and system once again switched into the fire mode, if you want to call it, for last 400 years once again. So these could be considered as a major systemic kind of transformation points, which are also translated in a way we could see into the temporal beta diversity, which is right here, which basically shows how transformed or how different, how dissimilar the system had been with respect to its starting point. So starting all the way from the 4,000 years before present, which could be here somewhere, and we could see that the things have been transformed all the way from this point to that point, and it does not necessarily have to be qualitative, but also quantitative in a way that the transformations have happened across the time, and there had been a transformation towards showing a positive trend or increasing trend in a way over the last 4,000 years. So when it comes to actual changes or landscape transformation and compositional changes as such, so let me drive you to the top part of the panel, which basically gives us our third kind of human, we could say actors or human tracers, is basically the type of land use. So if I could run you very quickly, and here I would like to zoom in, if I could quickly, that how this particular landscape, the Western Ghats landscape, have transformed across time by humans through different kinds of land use. So we are basically starting at the start of this particular timeline, we could see, we are starting at the Neolithic age, where we had a very localized kind of farming or nomadic kind of pastoralism, which eventually got into rice cultivation and sedentary kind of herding during the Iron Ages, and eventually getting into historic period where there had been the large scale establishment of paddy fields, eventually getting into intensified agroforestry and arboriculture or forest-based production. And eventually this particular region got into one of its first urban growth. And eventually, if we go towards or come closer and closer towards the present, we are talking about a colonial era which existed in India for almost 150 years or little more. That's the British era, which basically has established the agroforestry system as we see them today, which is coffee agroforestry, the cash crop agroforestry, which has been in existence for last 150 years, a little less than that, 100 years to be precise. And at the same time, we do have the forestry services getting set up under the British era. So even Indian forest services, it does have its roots in the colonial era. But before that, there is a little very interesting point that the sacred groves, the emergence of sacred groves, which has been paleoecologically confirmed and validated to be in existence for at least 400 years in this particular region. So if we want to sum that up in one particular line or one single line, we want to basically find out that over the last 4,000 years, especially at the start of the Common Era, which could be somewhere around here, we can find that the local land use has been transformed into more wide scale or regional land use. And as as a product of all these three, that increased aridity, fire episodes for fire periods, and the land use which is transforming this particular landscape, we can see that the arboreal pollen percentage, which will tell us the canopy cover, how much is the canopy cover, we can see that it is changing across the time. But if we could see that, what goes along with it, what goes hand in hand with that, is the plant diversity, which is based on the pollen, the taxon diversity, which we can find out based on the rarefaction. So we do have the floristic richness we could find out. And if we could see, the correlation is really strong between the canopy cover and the plant diversity. It is as good as I have faked these two curves because they are so much alike. So I basically are always trembled to show this particular figure, saying that, my goodness, they look exactly alike. So once again, what is the takeaway? So if you ask me what are the highlights in here, for in terms of the chronological sense, if we want to identify, especially when it comes to fires, fires are always thought to be notorious from the government perspective, from the forestry perspective, from the conservation perspective. So from the paleoecological record, we do see that use of fires does not always equate to loss of woodland. We do see that there are high fires, so there is a distinctive fire episode which existed between 1800 and 1400 years before present. But eventually, as we can see that the fires are managed more and more effectively, we could see that there is increase in the canopy cover along with that. So it does not necessarily mean that use of fires is always bad. When it comes to the plant diversity, if I want to quickly go ahead and touch upon it, we could see that the plant diversity itself is present day plant diversity in the Western Ghats is within the range of historic variability. That means we do have this entire range of plant diversity, as we could see, and we could see basically that the pre-common era, between the period between 4000 and 2000, where fires were almost non-existent in the landscape, we do have the lower sort of canopy cover as well as lower plant diversity as such, which eventually has picked up and continued on. So today's present day plant diversity, if we want to talk about, is slightly higher than its historic sort of so-called baseline, if we want to call it. Moving ahead, when it comes to diversity, so diversity comes in various shapes and forms. So I did not want to restrict myself to basically identifying the all terrestrial taxa diversity or plant diversity associated with only that, because the trees themselves are the key component of the landscape. So when it comes to actually applying the same kind of analysis, the rarefaction, to the canopy forming woody taxa, one would identify that whatever plant diversity changes we could see, these plant diversity changes are essentially are not because of the tree taxa, because we could see that the tree taxa diversity has been almost consistent except at this particular point throughout the last 4,000 years. So this is a very tricky and very interesting observation. So that means the plant diversity as such in this particular landscape, as we can find out, is due to the herbaceous understory and not necessarily because of the woody taxa. So it is very interesting observation when it comes to translating science into policy. This tells us something, and what it is, we can see that in a second. As we move towards this right figure, we are basically looking at very classic pollen diagram. I'm so sorry if there are less palynologists in the audience, but idea is basically to identify what kind of taxa exist in the landscape at any particular point. And this particular core goes all the way to the 8,000 year, although we are looking at last 4,000 years in this particular landscape, which is shown by this dotted line over here. We are basically seeing that how landscape, how forests have transformed. So this is forest, this is a canopy forming woody taxa, and this is a grassland. You could see it in yellowish color right here, this particular color. And the important component of the woody taxa is something called as the old growth trees or habitat specialist trees, which are considered to be native trees in the landscape. And are they really native? That's the very key question. And if we try to look at this particular core and go all the way to the bottom of it, all the way to the towards the 8,000 year, that could be the starting line for this particular core, we could see that these trees existed in the landscape since the beginning, and they have been forming almost 25% of the total canopy cover. So these trees, once again, being old growth trees or trees which are able to recover throughout the last 8,000 years or last 4,000 years for the sake of this particular study, we could see that they are resilient enough to be able to back in the landscape whenever there was a chance. So once again, what are the highlights? First, when it comes to the diversity, it is herbs and not the woody taxa that make Western Ghats diverse. Second thing is there are old growth or habitat specialist trees they have shown long-term resilience towards varying degrees of land use and land management over the last 8,000 years, if not for the sake of this specific study, let's say 4,000 years. And when it comes to these habitat specialist trees, once again, how should we translate them into policy? Because many of these habitat specialist trees are already part of baselines, biological baselines, which are part of the conservation networks. So this somehow validates in a way empirically that these old growth trees are indeed native in a way conservationists perceive them. And it would be interesting if we could have patches of these native trees on agroforestry landscapes when it comes to maintaining these landscapes, actually using native trees on landscapes, which could be the natural places to focus organized conservation and restoration efforts beyond forest. And this is one of the very key and important message we do have for this from this particular study. And let's touch upon this as we go and move ahead. So when it comes to anthropogenic fires, there are other ways in order to convey what science tells or science informs or science helps in a way. Helps is a less condescending word here, I would say, to policy, because chronological narratives are not always interesting for conservationists. It is very important to show that how systems transform across the time, but in some other way where we can actually see what could be the starting points, which could be this roughly 4,000 years versus the end points of the system as they move ahead. So here, what I tried to compare is macroscopic charcoal and microscopic charcoal, plotting it against the all terrestrial taxa plant diversity, which once again runs between 20 and 60, you could see here. And here, the canopy forming woody taxa, their diversity against fires. And when we look at this, and when we look at the R square values, which is the correlation between these, we can see that the plant diversity, when it comes to the all terrestrial taxa or canopy forming woody taxa, is very, very weakly correlated with fires. So fires, once again, do not necessarily mean loss of woodland and loss of diversity. It is only sustained burning which is coupled with the aridity at times within those two intervals, we could see that which had been concomitant, they are able to reduce diversity. So now in this case, if I have to point out one thing, is the lowest diversity point, which we could see is roughly between one of the first fire events, as we could imagine or as we could remember, between 1800 and 1400 years before present. So once again, the fires have started somewhere around here. That's the switching point, if you could remember. And then eventually fires have been diminished around 1400, which is 1436 technically from the chronological point of view. So this point is somewhere midway between that particular fire, the first fire interval as such. So somewhere between, with consistent burning or sustained burning coupled with enhanced aridity, as I said, was able to reduce diversity. And that could be once again from the systemic point of view due to increased canopy opening. So what does this tell us about slash and burn agriculture or anthropogenic fires, which are very localized and very low intensity burning? So when it comes to burning as such or anthropogenic fires, they once again do not equate directly to loss of woodland or loss of diversity. So in that context, if we really have to come up with a middle ground between the traditional practices of agricultural burning and avoidance of fires on forest reserves, which is strictly maintained by Indian Forest Services as such. So the middle ground between forest farmers and the foresters and their practices could be an evidence-based middle ground, which could be the low intensity burns on the agricultural land itself, which could be partially supervised or partially regulated in a way, of course, both parties agreeing. So with that context, I would like to quickly touch upon like what could be the future directions for this particular project. So we are trying to look into the plant diversity across space and time, because this was only one of the cores which have informed us about this. So if we are able to replicate similar kind of results for rest of the three, are there any different lessons learned from the other three or all the four if we want to compare? And these are some of the very proxy kind of data sets, if you want to call it that. If you want to specifically use tags on richness, how should we use them and how should we compare and what should we take care of by not leading into something really precarious? So with that, I would like to go ahead and like give some last insights or last notes on the Western Ghats agroforestry landscapes and biodiversity conservation in one of the world's biodiversity hotspot. Is according to this study and according to group of studies which on which this study has been built upon, is in the Western Ghats, the fire and plant diversity relationship is quite non-linear across time. So once again, there is no one-to-one relationship between fires and plant diversity and canopy cover. It's not one on one that when it comes to fires, it is expected that there is immediate loss of woodland. If it is sustained fire, yes, there is a loss of woodland and then there is loss of plant diversity, but if managed, not really. So this is something to be kept in mind in terms of the empirical point of view. The second thing which has been interesting is the tree cover or a canopy cover is a vital, most important determinant of sustaining the plant diversity in the Western Ghats or wet tropics in general. When there are more trees in the landscapes, there is more space for herbaceous taxa, and herbaceous taxa are the ones which are basically contributing to the diversity. So when it comes to actual management perspective for the effective fire and ecological managements in the tropics, in Western Ghats or wet tropics, if you want to call it at large, it will require always, once again, this is something not a rocket science. It is something which people have said before, and this is something just highlighting that we definitely need a long-term perspective. We definitely need how landscapes have transformed before we go ahead and make management frameworks, because it is important to know that what is native, what are we cultivating and what should not be cultivating, how should we use fires effectively in the landscape, and what else it demands, what else ecological and fire management in tropical regions or any regions for that matter demands is an inclusive and integrated approach. And what's the takeaway on that from this particular study? So this particular study shows that there had been episodes where there were burnings, people have burned the landscape, but people have also deliberately planted trees. Otherwise, it would not have been possible to recover canopy cover. So it is important to recognize that people are part of the landscape. It is finally a social and ecological system. These two systems and these two entities cannot be separated from one another. So although there are some negative kind of narratives, but there are also positive kind of narratives or positive stories which have shown that planting trees by people intentionally or maintaining sacred groves have contributed towards the conservation beyond forest, which is essential for landscape level connectivity, which will eventually get us into better and better biodiversity conservation frameworks. So in that context, policies definitely are needed to be evidence-based and informed of historical and cultural regimes simultaneously. If they are planned in tandem with the traditional knowledge, it is only the way we can get things right. So when it comes to maintaining both social and ecological sites, we have agroforestry systems that have a potential to work towards biodiversity. So in this particular case, in the light of national agroforestry policy, so there are certain lessons learned which are empirically validated about biological baselines, about ecological frameworks, about fire management, which could be put to work directly. Once again, they have to be planned in tandem with the historical and cultural regime. They have to be planned in tandem with the traditional knowledge in the light of future monsoonal variability. And what do we need for that? So this is something I definitely include on my slides. Is the big picture is, in order to adopt or in order to address any of these issues, we all have to go interdisciplinary. So this is a very, very, very interdisciplinary kind of problem. What we need is an ecosystem approach where we are bringing together knowledge and engagement from all the stakeholders, all the end users of the system, be it social, be it ecological. So when it comes to that, what each of us need to do is, each of us need to be wearing different hats at a time. We need to be thinking various different ways, in whatever different ways we can think of, and bring people together, collaborate and talk and communicate about it, and talk about how we are able to achieve it, and who are we basically. So it is very important to find out a common narrative, a common language, which we do not necessarily have. I'm not even talking about scientists and policymakers. Even we do not have a common language within different disciplines of sciences, if we can say so. And communication could be the key, collaboration could be the key, because it is finally an ecosystem decision. Although we have our problems which are global, each ecosystem is different, so our solutions are pretty local. So while thinking global, we have to act local, and for that we do have multi-tier and multi-tier communications and narratives and ways, like platforms like this, where we can talk to one another. So this is very important when it comes to thinking about translate any science into policy or learning, uh, and thinking about policy getting into scientific methodologies or scientific research questions. That is very, very, very important. So with that, I would like to thank you for listening, and I would love if you could stay in touch with the project and with me by whatever means. Just pick your favorite mode of connections and whatnot, and that would be the way we could continue communicating about this. Once again, I would like to acknowledge the funders, European Union, Mary Sklodowska-Curie Actions, or H2020 program. That's the bigger frame, bigger umbrella. And thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much for a really, really cool talk. It was great to see like the interspersed between like science and policy and paleo stuff. It's like really cool. Cool. So we have some questions. So the first one that we've got, so there are three anonymous questions. So the first one, why do you think that the last two aridity periods that have enhanced fire started only about 400 years into the arid periods? Is there a lag in how people respond after the climate starts to change?
Yeah, I think that would be the answer. That it could be a response to the climate change, but I would think so about towards the start of the common era. So if I could flip back to my slide and if I could just point out, that would be easier. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So when it comes to distinctive fire periods, once again, these are the periods of enhanced aridity, right? Once again, and these two are the periods I think the person who is asking question has asked about. So this period right here, once again, this could be largely a response in a way towards the climate change, but not this much, not this one, the second fire period. Are you able to see my pointer? It's vanishing.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah. So, okay. So for this, I could be, I mean, we cannot be 100% sure or confident, but this particular period could be I'm sorry, just a moment. Yeah, this particular fire period could be a response to the aridity period. And at the same time, once again, this is a major transformation period, as I said, like between Iron Ages, which was sort of a localized kind of culture, getting into more regional and more large scale establishment of paddy fields. So maybe people needed this much fire to establish paddy fields. And once they have established it and the climate has improved or the monsoon has recurred in its usual mode, if you want to call it that, then they did not need fires anymore. So maybe this particular, the first fire mode or first fire period right here between 1800 and 1400 could be a response to aridity. But this one, I think last 500 years, or maybe I'm a little bit, what should I say, biased towards this, because we are already too much into closer to the industrial era and little before that, towards the Middle Ages and whatnot, where we have already been seeing some changes which were large scale. So I really doubt this could qualify as a response to climate, a response to reduced monsoon. Yeah, part of it is at Little Ice Age, which I just realized that I forgot to point out. But anyway, the Little Ice Age aridity could have been one of the reasons of reduced water supply and whatnot. And then that at that point, sacred grooves, they emerge at that particular point. So I don't know whether this one, I don't know whether I would call it as a response to aridity. But this one, I think so. Yeah, it could be. And then people just went on and went ahead, and yeah, they said that why not?
Cool, thank you. So we have one question from Georgia Camperio. Great talk. Why charcoal, micro and macro, is not as high coming towards present
time? Yeah, so I mean, that could go back to the it's very interesting that why not, but it's just, I mean, it's just there. That's one of the answers I could give. The second thing is, especially when it comes to the British era, last, as I said, like 150 years, so the colonial mindset had been the fires are 100% bad, because they did not see any fires in their landscape, or whether they have seen it, they definitely had more grasslands versus forest like ecosystem. So once again, that could have been one of the reasons that fires, either they were suppressed 100%, which is definitely true for the colonial era, for the British era, for last 150 years, and that could be one of the reasons I could say that. Yeah, so there is no other reason I could see that why they are so low as such, and they could have been. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. One last question. What types of charcoal did you look at?
Yeah, so types in the sense, are we getting into the morphology? I didn't get the question 100%.
It doesn't mention.
Yeah. So if the person who has asked question is around, maybe he or she is able to explain.
So my guess would probably be something like lignite or anthracite. Or...
Yeah, no, I think it could be to do with the whether it is wood charcoal versus other kinds of charcoal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it is, I mean, it is not, it is wood charcoal when it comes to macro charcoal, right? Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for your talk. I'm just going to take over the screen just after you. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. Please remember to fill out the Survey Monkey, so we'll put the link in the chat so we can learn a bit more about who's here today. And join us next week to hear Matthew Jones from the University of Kansas present a talk called Out of the Dark, the Mysterious Origins and Rapid Diversification of Bats. So today we're actually going to skip straight through into tea time. And we will start off with our icebreaker question. If you could live in one paleo environment, which one would you choose? So we encourage you to stay for this. We've decided to do this just because we're a really small group today.